Hello, everybody, and welcome again to today's Lean-In session. I'm Michael Linke here in Melbourne on behalf of the Australian Institute of Architects. It's great to have you with us yet again today. Today, we're really proud to present our member Lean-In session in conjunction with Reconciliation Conversations. This is an initiative which was launched back in 2019 by the New South Wales chapter's Reconciliation Working Group. This program consists of provocations, of policy and project conversations focused on progressing reconciliation across the architectural profession in New South Wales and also across Australia. In today's session, we're really excited. We're going to be featuring artists Tony Albert and Daniel Boyd. And today's session, you won't see me. This will be chaired by Samantha Rich. Samantha Rich works at Billard Lease Partnership as the project design coordinator. She's a Wiradjuri woman and a member of the Institute's Reconciliation Working Group. She's pursuing a master's degree in architecture at the University of New South Wales, and she's worked for Design Inc., for SJB, and also for Lendlease previously. Samantha's passion is really in the area of incorporating the needs of Aboriginal Australians into the design of spaces through her projects and working to implement strategies towards reconciliation within the practice of architecture and the broader built environment. So we're really thrilled to be able to welcome Samantha as host to the Lean-In today. Samantha, I hope you're well, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Hi everyone. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm meeting on the ancestral lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of this land. I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture and hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across the nation. I would like to also extend my respects to any other Indigenous people who are joining the session today. I'm very excited to have the honour of introducing our amazing speakers today. In this session, first up, we will have Girrimay, Yidinji, Kuku, Yalanji man, Tony Albert. Tony Albert is a renowned politically minded artist whose work examines the legacy of racial and cultural misrepresentation, particularly of Australia's Aboriginal people. Albert's work plays with the tension arising from the visibility and in turn the invisibility of Aboriginal people across the news media, literature and the visual world. Tony will discuss, along with Peter Lonergan and Julie Cracknell from Cracknell and Lonergan Architects, the Hyde Park Memorial, Thou Didst Let Fall, the Hyde Park Memorial which they collaborated together on. This memorial honours Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women who served in our nation's military and their families. Following this, we will have Kudjala, Gangalu, Kuku Yalanji, Waka, Gubbi, Wangerriburra, Bundjalung man, Daniel Boyd, and Kim Bridgeland from Edition Office talking about their project For Our Country. Daniel Boyd is also a renowned artist whose practice is internationally recognised for its engagement with the colonial history of the Australia-Pacific region. His work reveals the complexity of perspectives through which political, cultural and personal memory is composed. Boyd has both Aboriginal and Pacific Islander heritage, and his work traces this cultural and visual ancestry in relation to the broader history of Western art. Daniel and Kim will elaborate on their project, which is also an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander memorial at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. Both projects are memorials, and their works promote an understanding and reflection of the different perspectives that people have of history. They invite us to question how placemaking through architecture and art can highlight conversations on injustices and inequalities in Australian society, and how we can celebrate cultures through contemplation and remembrance. Over to Tony and Peter and Julie. Thanks.
Hi, everyone.
Tony.
Hi, Peter and Julie. Hello, everyone viewing. So my name is Tony. Thank you for that really wonderful introduction. I'm actually coming to you all from Brisbane. I live and work in Sydney normally, but found myself in lockdown in Brisbane a few months ago, and I've been here ever since, waiting for the borders to reopen and return. I guess you could say opportunity came around with the City of Sydney doing an invitation for a memorial in Hyde Park. And I guess where I was at in my own practice, I was investigating quite a bit of my own family history in involvement in war at that time. My auntie had just written this book for the National Museum of Australia based on my grandfather's story as a time of a prisoner of war. It was kind of a part of my, a big part of my family history has been serving with the military. So the story itself is about my grandfather, but 5 of his 8 children actually served within the Army, Navy or Air Force with over 80 years combined military history. And I was also a what was considered with the Australian Memorial a war artist, and I did my time with Border Security and Sea Patrol in the Northern Territory with an avenue of the Army called Norforce, which is primarily Aboriginal servicemen and women spread from the Torres Strait all the way over to Broome in Western Australia. And they are very situated in very, very small communities, which a normal army officer would never be deployed or live in these kind of remote communities. They've, possibly 5 to 10 houses. And these people are, incredibly respected within the service, and they do all their training, which I was privileged to do with them, and understanding how they survey the land and watch for any incidences that may occur. They send that information back to the head office in the ACT, where the Australian Army does a statistical analyst about the situation and see if they need to deploy people to be there. So there was this moment where my life seemed kind of all intertwined and informed by the army and infantry, and when this opportunity came about, and I was, I was really interested in the possibility of doing that. So there's incredible, sensitivities and ideas around that, and I'm from the get-go, one of the biggest, I feel, not so much a disadvantage, but something I was very mindful of, that I don't come from Sydney, nor do my people. I have no connection there, aside from the fact that I was living and working there. My family is from North Queensland. But I had to take into consideration that this was, the proposal was for a national memorial for Indigenous men and women. And I don't believe that should discount other Aboriginal people from anywhere over Australia being able to contribute to that voice. And I also feel Sydney as a metropolitan city is, should be a place where we embrace the idea of public art from not only all over Australia, but hopefully all over the world. But in saying that, there were certain protocols as an Aboriginal person which I had to follow and be mindful on working off other people's land. And I'm grateful to be able to work with an architecture firm like Cracknell and Lonergan, which has so much deeply embedded history in working with community, not only on a professional but a personal level. Peter and Julie are very well known within the community. And that was, something that was really important, because throughout the whole process, I really wanted to make sure that we, any member of the community was able to meet with us at any given point in time, but that we were having current and constant meetings, giving an opportunity for anyone to be able to come and raise their concerns, and that there are other invested and interested parties. So this was one of the biggest in terms of a public artwork, because it not just involved the City of Sydney, it involved the Australian War Memorial, the Army and Infantry, the local Aboriginal community, but then also an Aboriginal men's group in the community, which kind of were dedicated to looking after, caring for kind of a men's group and sharing information. So these were all people I felt that really needed to be on side and advocating for the fact that me as an outsider was doing that. I know that's just a brief introduction, but I feel like is Peter and Julie wanted to say anything? Or?
Would you like me to share the screen?
Oh yeah, that would be great, so people can be seeing what we're talking about all through it. So one of the biggest challenges and issues I found with looking at the idea of a national Indigenous memorial is that Aboriginal people weren't written into history within the context of war. Through this, I would find, photos. It was pictures of Captain so-and-so or Colonel so-and-so with unidentified Aboriginal men. Like, these names were not recorded. People could not enlist in the army as Aboriginal at that time. So the records under that were not kept or recorded. So the idea of even just simply listing Aboriginal names was not an option at all. So what I wanted to do was use my grandfather's story, so a personal story, a story which I knew I had permission to be able to use as a metaphor for all these incredible, amazing stories that are attached to Aboriginal life and culture, stories that are oral in their representation and the way they've been handed down, that they're not part of the history books, as we would see with mainstream Australia. I also wanted to highlight and recognise the injustice with war as well. And this started from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men and women have served in every war that has happened in this country, starting from the Boer War in the early 1900s. What we don't know is, like, something with the Boer War. During the time that this had happened, we brought in what was known as the White Australia policy here in this country. So there were people that went and served, Aboriginal men that went and served for this country, that actually were not allowed back into this country after the war had done. And many of those men are buried overseas, a majority in South Africa. And I think the count when I was doing this and researching was about 60 men that weren't allowed back into Australia after. I mean, and that's such a incredibly shocking part of Australian history that is not recounted within the vernacular of the way in which we celebrate Anzac Day or understand Anzac Day. Then we have things like World War I and World War II. And in the case of my grandfather's history and story, was a prisoner of war in Germany, escaped to Italy in Biella, was sentenced to death before an officer in charge said that the men were British allies and had to be returned to Germany. This was before 3 of the men he was with were shot. But he returned, then the war finished, he went back to London and then came back to Australia, in the very short version of the story. But these men and women thought that they were going to change the vernacular of Australia and the way in which they were looked and viewed upon. And, when servicemen and women returned to Australia, they were given land as part of their settlement and part of their payment. So not only did Aboriginal people not receive this, they were still getting their land taken off them. They were still getting their children taken off them. So there, again, all this, incredible history that is not part of the vernacular we share when we talk about Anzac and that spirit. And that was something that I wanted to incorporate within the memorial. I didn't want it to glorify war in any certain way. I guess one of the biggest criticisms that this memorial has is its harshness. And when people say that, I kind of go like, well, you get it. This is not a celebration in any way, shape or form. This is reflective of, the harsh reality of war. And that's what I really wanted from the start, and what I brought to Peter and Julie to kind of execute that vision for me in a way that could, hopefully stand the test of time.
I suppose in our initial research around what Tony's been talking about, I first of all looked at the memorial that was in Hyde Park at the moment, and that same brutal symbolism was criticised back in the 1930s when the Dellet Memorial was first built, and that slowly dissipated over the years. But when it was first opened, there was a lot of criticism of the military iconography, that the 303 shells that were in the stained glass windows, the unknown soldier memorial being held up by his mother and sisters, and then but Julie had researched right back into the history of Hyde Park as a meeting ground. Julie, do you want to talk a little bit about that? early history or the early European history of Hyde Park?
Yes. So this is a way of acknowledging country too, looking at the site and its complexities. Oops. Tony's memorial, Yidinji, is in there. Can you see that hand? Which is intended to be near the memorial, so there's some dialogue, but a contemplative place, and you can't see it through the canopy, close to Elizabeth Street, which is really important for a history of marches, starting with the 1938 march, one in 1948 with May Day march, where there were placards saying we can go to war, but we're not allowed to drink or have our freedoms. The 1938 march was a march for the right to land, not to have children taken away. And this was by soldiers, people who had fought in the First World War. Anzac Day marches go down, naturally down Elizabeth Street and at Hyde Park. The Diggers March, the Black Diggers March from Redfern, often comes down to there, and just recently we've had Black Lives Matter rallies, big meetings at the northern end, but in this location. And this is 30 years after the inquiry into deaths in custody and 30 years after the first Reconciliation Action Plan. And I think Tony's sculpture is testimony to that as well. So there are a whole lot of influences. So the site has always been a meeting place or a meeting ground, place for ceremony, for dispute resolution, where hundreds of people, it's been reported by a number of people coming from countries all around, where we got all the Eura countries, Darawal, out west, Wiradjuri country, big gatherings coming to this particular area here. And people were very interested, recording the boomerangs that were used and the shields, and then afterwards, after this big meeting or contest, they go down to the Botanic Gardens or down to Domain, which is around there, and for a big debrief and have fires and song and dance and go all night. So this is into the 1820s, until, of course, Governor Macquarie stopped from bearing their weaponry, and people moved off to La Perouse and to Redfern area. So this place has connections with that as well. Down at Sydney Cove or Gangalu, an important ceremony, Yulang initiation ceremony, happened, and people from across the way, the Gamaragal and other local country people, men and women, come to that ceremony. It's also this, it's a marker. Tony's Yidinji is a marker on the Eora journey, but the Eora journey's encompassed a whole lot of other places. I'm interested in this idea of connectivity that First Nations artists and designers speak about connecting across time and across places. In this little, Tony produced this logbook during the process, and it's interesting on this page here, he mentions camouflage, and I suppose looking from the air, this place of contemplation, camouflage. The boomerang in the landscape was important. When we first met Tony, he was collecting kitsch objects that appropriated Aboriginal images, and he'd retell the perspective on the on these objects that he'd work on, for example, and a lot of them are boomerang-shaped ashtrays, and all with the face of an Aboriginal man or something similar, and Tony would just incorporate onto that "ash on me," which corrects the story a bit. At Hyde Park, there's the statue of Captain Cook, which we seem to have a big problem with correcting the inaccuracies on the plaque. That's all we have to do. But in Tony's way, he does that with his art, incorporating 2 points of view and correcting the story. So we're back to the memorial.
And Tony always had we struggled with the idea of public art and how the process seems to, in some ways, it takes the artist, and this is our experience in working with artists in public art projects. The process does have a tendency to take the artist out of the kind of the central focus. And in the work that we do with artists in public artworks is to try and ensure that the artist has the central place. And Tony and we were constantly frustrated by the other involved organisations, the people that were basically the people that were paying for it, trying to kind of wrest the control from Tony, and we constantly fought for that. But it must be terribly frustrating for an artist to have their independence, and you know, we think the great thing about artists is that independence and their ability to be able to follow one big idea, and we just see our job to try and protect the representation of that one big idea and keep the interference to a minimum. But I remember at one stage we were walking around with someone from the council doing a dilapidation survey, and we were hundreds and hundreds of metres away from the site, taking those cracks in paths. And I think, Tony, you were surprised by that level of control that seemed to be occurring.
So we're part of architectural services is to solve all of those problems along the way. We had a lot of but what keeps us going is the vision, is Tony's vision and the story, and that doesn't change. So you just deal with all of these little interventions and interruptions and questions. The one example was with the shape of the boomerang in the landscape, and it's a beautiful shape that that kind of embraces a gathering area on a gentle rise. But there were questions about its intrusiveness on the geometric axial arrangement of the park, which we dealt with, and that was solved. But these, the boomerang shape is a really integral part of the whole artwork, and by incorporating it into the land, kind of brings back the ownership with, and then authority to share it again. And was some of the questions that it was interrupting the hierarchy of the formal and informal geometry, and that the other monuments around the park had a strategic axial setting, and that there were also satellite monuments in grassed areas, and we had to consider that this just be in a grassed area as a monument rather than a place for gathering, I think. Anyway, the possibility of compromising the pattern of the park. But then looking into it, see this layout, I think this may have been what was alarming, this bright red boomerang in the geometric landscape. But the thing about it is all of this layout was, and the monument, the Anzac Memorial, were done in this Australian mood of allegiance to the British Empire and nationalism that was fully behind white Australia as a policy and to be protected. And this is all symbolic in the park. In the plan of management for Hyde Park, there's no mention of its Aboriginal significance at all. I don't know if it's been updated. It starts with, the history starts with Macquarie, and the timeline starts with Captain Cook. So there's no, and even post Macquarie, it's been a strong Aboriginal place. There was a racetrack there where, in the 1840s, and we know of some Aboriginal people who actually died in that park. Okay, I'm looking at the time. At the time of the memorial being built, there was a Gadigal man from Woolloomooloo called Fernando, who went to Paris, went to the Vatican and to London, dressed in a black cloak covered in little white skeletons, protesting the abuse of Aboriginal people in Australia at the time that all of these plans were being made for the Anzac Memorial. This is just an expression of the courage of Aboriginal people, and I think of public artists. So this, I don't like these two images together, but within a year after, Majami was opened, the papers, Macquarie's papers were uncovered, which proved his incitement of a massacre in the Minto region, and in Appin, and within months his statue was put at the northern end of Hyde Park, which we thought was astounding. But the reason for putting these two images up is just to acknowledge the courage of public, of Aboriginal and of First Nations public artists, because there's always these this sort of resistance, underlying resistance. But I look at this public artwork, and 2 fallen, 4 standing strong to tell the story. I'll move on. Are we running out of time?
Maybe just a couple more minutes to wrap up, and then we'll move over to Daniel, and we can keep going.
Well, we might just
afterwards.
We just go through the rest of these, and then.
So we worked with Tony on the I suppose it was sort of a competition, but basically Tony put together a really beautiful handwritten, hand-drawn set of images of the proposal, and then when Tony was awarded the commission, and we set about doing sort of pretty standard architectural documentation and fabrication, and then eventually installation in the park. But again, with that sort of constant sort of interference from the commissioning group, that it seemed to kind of bear out the name of the work all the way along. That in the same way that Aboriginal people were treated in the country and were let to fall, they were sort of, were left alone. We all sort of felt a little bit the same during the process of this major public artwork. And despite all of that, though, it's incredibly beautiful and incredibly strong. Tony, do you want to say something to say how good we were?
No, I think the end result, despite all those troubles, that I certainly stuck to as much as I could the plan in involving the community, in keeping up the community meetings with it. This was the first time the City of Sydney had an Indigenous groundbreaking ceremony to start the whole process. So long before anything, the shovel hit the ground, I wanted the area to be cleansed and to be blessed, and to know that going forward there was an understanding that this land was going to look after us through this whole process. The people who were working on that site, that was very important to me, and for my own family to also come down from North Queensland as direct descendants of the story that I was talking about, and honour the landscape attached to it. One of the reasons I did pick this place within Hyde Park was that it sits between 2 ginormous fig trees, which are all the way up the east coast of Australia, but in the rainforest of North Queensland, where I'm from, that's where shields and spears are made from that tree. So it's a way that I think it's a part of the landscape that actually brings these different communities and stuff together. And there is an actual ceremonial aspect of the memorial as well, through the Coolamon and the foliage, which is designed in case Aboriginal person does arrive at the memorial and feels compelled in some way, shape or form to do a ceremony, that there is an opportunity to smoke, to light fire. And one of the great things about the Hyde Park Memorial is that is actually utilised, but utilised in a number of different ways. So say when pre-Mardi Gras, where Hyde Park is used as the kind of gathering space, the Indigenous community actually used, the Coolamon and have a fire on that night and actually smoke themselves before they go and do that walk. So I think there is wonderful ways in which, the memorial is being activated under different premises, but for the same kind of significant purpose. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a really beautiful part of Hyde Park, and I think harsh is the wrong word. I think it makes a very strong statement, and it kind of adds to the entire space. You know, when you think of disrupting the actual axial kind of arrangement, it's like, you know, is that a bad thing? Because an axial arrangement has underlying kind of connections to colonialism and the colonial placemaking. So sometimes disrupting that actual alignment is actually a really good thing, because we're kind of disrupting that space and kind of taking it back to a more kind of organic or natural way that a space is. And I think that the monument is the way that we've started to do that, is kind of take that space back. And I might just kind of finish you guys up for now, and then pass over to Daniel, to Dan, and to Kim. But thank you so much. It was amazing.
Thanks, Julie, Peter, and Tony. Dan, are you there? Do you want to introduce, or do you want me to start?
No, you start, and then I'll come in.
I'm just going to give you 2 seconds, everybody. Hello, everybody out there that we can't see. Fantastic to have you with us. Okay. Pardon me. So, as architects, which is, I guess, the forum that we're in right now, it's really important to have an understanding that whenever we work, we're always working from within the context of this nation's colonial legacy. This country, this nation, was formed within the framework of great deceit and of great trauma to its indigenous inhabitants. And to allow that to happen, a narrative had to be constructed within the collective mind of those advancing the colonial project, that the original occupants of this land were not sufficiently worthy, in fact, that they were less than human, and that they had no rights to the lands that they had been caretakers of for over 60,000 years. The underlying premise of this false narrative still exists today, and continues to devalue the lives of First Nations people. We're at a point in our history where the memory of this trauma has been removed from the story that this nation has tried and keeps trying to tell itself. And by removing that memory of systematic dispossession of land, life and culture, we have a society with a profoundly unbalanced playing field, where the injustices of the last 230 years are hardwired into our economic, education, judicial, incarceration systems. Our distorted national mythology perpetuates this, as it continues to center the lived experience, the gaze of the non-Indigenous worldview, and continues to petition the Indigenous gaze and their lived experience as other, as a fringe issue. There is an immense range of cultural and historical narratives embedded within the built environment and within the sites that we seek to build upon as architects. But our architectural heritage and the monuments that we're talking about today, that we celebrate within it, I guess not the ones we're talking about today, the ones that are a background to what we're talking about today, almost exclusively reinforce and legitimize the stories of colonial settlement and its European heritage. As our towns and cities are the backdrop to where we live and grow up, we generally accept these stories without questioning who or what they represent, because they are there, because they're large, they're old, and because they're visible, they gain legitimacy. And importantly, what has been forgotten or ignored does not gain legitimacy. As architects, and whether we understand it or not, we play a significant role in the narrative formation of this country. Each and every project we design is an implicit cultural and political act. So architecture has got an extremely important role, not only in sensitively responding to the needs of and communities that it serves, but in giving presence to marginalized voices and their lived experience within our collective story. And with that presence, with bringing that presence into our collective story, and with the centering of the Indigenous gaze, comes a greater authority to have a stronger level of political self-determination. That's my start. Dan, do you want to bring in the context of the work?
Yeah, oh, actually, can we go back to the
Yeah, sure.
image? So I was approached to propose a a memorial that was to represent armed servicemen and women in the Australian Armed Forces. And it was also a competition. There were 4 others that proposed memorials, and we were fortunate enough to win the commission to produce this memorial. I'd always kind of set out with the work to try to create something that was able to draw the person who was having the experience into the memorial, so that it wasn't just an object that was sitting in the landscape like a lot of the others that are around the gardens at the memorial. It was it needed to be an inclusive space, and one that was accepting of other people. And so for our country, we're trying to remove any dominant narrative was a way for as many people as possible with a connection to the legacy of defending country to be able to come into the memorial in a way that was an inclusive space. So I approached Edition Office, understanding that I wanted to create an experience that was a spatial experience, one that used light and form and understanding of materials to kind of drive the project. And it's only, so Tony was speaking about the experience of, or the relationship that First Nations people have to, or have had to the armed forces since actually even as early as the 1860s in the colonial armed forces, that they never had an official memorial to people that had fought or in different capacities for their country. And with this project, I wanted to kind of open that up to the idea of the Frontier Wars as well. So the title kind of allowed this to become a part of the memorial in a way. So Kim, maybe if we go to the next slide. So this is in central Queensland, and this is a depiction of a conflict on the frontier. I have a very direct relationship to a particular massacre that happened, and so these things are quite important to me, to be able to share the experience of First Nations people in Australia, as well as the stories that Tony was talking about with people going overseas and not being able to return, or going overseas and returning and not receiving the same compensation that non-Indigenous people had. And what I was trying to do with the work was to have people understand this like a plurality, so about individuals' rights to perception, and in a non-homogeneous way. So understanding the beauty in difference, in locality, and the truth within these lenses that people see or understand their relationship to a particular place. So we when we started with it, I kind of so this is a map of massacre sites across Australia. So I also wanted to kind of underpin the memorial with the entire relationship to defending country, and it was I guess it was a way to present something. And when I went to edition office, Kim and Aaron, I had an initial idea, which was the mirrored surface, that the facade on the memorial. And when you Kim, if we can just go through to maybe an image of the memorial.
Mm-hmm. I'll flick through and then we'll come back.
Yeah.
There's going to be a lot of flicking back and forward.
So yeah, in that drawing, well, actually, yeah. So when you're looking at the facade of the memorial, it's a two-way mirror, and there's a veil that's been put like across the surface. So you see the landscape kind of broken down into these individual lenses, or like dots. From the interior of the space, you see back through the mirror. And so what I guess for me, this kind of this threshold is kind of like the entrance to a cave. You know, we kind of understand how we project outwards, but also, like, you know, the big questions that we have within about you know, within that are very difficult to ask or understand, and a place of contemplation that might be a personal space, was what I was trying to get across with the veil. So it's always kind of been about light and relationship to light, but it's also a way for understanding this an expanse of time and people's relationship to that expanse of time. And so it was a very fluid and open process. I came to them with this the concept of the mirror, and edition office created the structure to situate the mirror panels. I mean, it was a pretty straightforward process. There were hurdles along the way, and I guess it was a similar experience to Tony and to Crack Mulligan. I think people didn't really, the people involved in the making of the memorial didn't really understand the significance of it and the importance that it had for so many different people, so many different nations across this country. And actually, yeah. Did you want to say anything about it, Kim? Like the process, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, look, the client, the War Memorial, and the Council of Elders, and that process was incredibly supportive. The original commission was for I think what they had expected was a typical memorial, which is an object in the park, which is what they had normally done. And we had proposed, more than that, something that offered that collective gathering space, but also gave that interior space to go inside and be sheltered within it. So more of a building than a sculpture. But the initial brief was a 6 square metre site, an incredibly small thing. We designed what we proposed. The building itself fit within that 6 square metre area, with the basalt field in front, kind of expanding out from it. But when we were selected for the project, we had a really honest conversation with them. We made it really clear that we thought it needed to be bigger, and they said, "Great, just you tell us what it needs to be." They fully supported and committed to the project, and allowed us to say, "Look, we actually think it should be, instead of the initial 6 meters wide at the front, it needs to be 10 meters wide. It needs to be big enough, to really withdraw into the center of the space." So from that perspective, there was great support. The conceptual intent was never challenged, but we did have struggles with the builders, who, it would have been wonderful if everyone, included within the process, was, involved respectfully, but that wasn't always the case. But we're very glad that through that process, the outcome came through. I'm just going to run right back to the top, Dan. Give me 2 seconds.
Do you want to talk about the functionality through after you go through these?
I will. Yeah, I'll come back to the plans and we'll kind of talk about, I guess, what we've designed and why. Just before we leave this, if anyone is interested in this resource, it's a fantastic one. Hosted by The Guardian, but I think mostly put together by the University of Newcastle Colonial Frontier Massacres project team. There's a database that they're constantly adding to with new research in terms of every single conflict, resistance, war, or massacre site across Australia. So if you're interested in pursuing that, look up The Guardian's Killing Times, and you'll find that there. So from the context that that Tony and Dan have spoken about in terms of Indigenous diggers going and serving for Australia in international conflict, doing that from the perspective of the frontier wars, children being stolen, land being stolen, culture being erased. I think it's quite profound, that backdrop. That so many people did sign up and serve. Who we're looking at now is Quandamukawun, and Army Corporal Kath Walker, Udguru Ninakal. She enlisted in the Australian Women's Army Service in 1942 after her 2 brothers were captured by the Japanese at the fall of Singapore. Her service in the Army gave her access to training and educational opportunities that just were otherwise totally unavailable to her as an Aboriginal woman. Apologies for the pixelated images. This is Walter Christopher George Saunders from Warrnambool, Victoria, a Gunda Jamara man. He worked as a groom, enlisted in 1916 in the 10th Machine Gun Company in World War I, of the Australian Imperial Force, as it was known then. His stories of friendship, I suppose, adventure on that conflict, but freedom from the persecution within white Australia during World War I inspired his son, who we can see here, to enlist in World War II. His son was Captain Reginald Saunders. Another Gunda Jamara soldier, Herbert Starr Lovett, he served as a machine gunner on the Western Front during the First World War, and then signed up again for the Second World War. But after returning from service, was denied land under the Soldier Settlement Scheme, which was administered by the federal government and the Victoria government, despite meeting all of the selection criteria except for being Aboriginal. He watched on as his traditional homeland around Lake Condah which is the site of Australia's only UNESCO World Heritage recognised area, recognised solely for its Indigenous cultural heritage, at Lake Condo, which is the extraordinary Bundjalung World Heritage Site that is referenced in the NGV Architecture Commission that we've designed with Ioannis Scarce. That land, when he came back, was not, was instead of being offered the land that was, I guess in one sense, owed in the soldier settlement scheme, was being distributed to white soldiers. And to further that rejection, I suppose, until very recently, until the memorials we're talking about today, there were no formally sanctioned or formally commissioned state-sanctioned war memorials for this Australian or Indigenous service in general. What we're looking at now is, it's an incredibly important site. This is a memorial on Mount Ainslie behind the Australian War Memorial, so behind the site of our project. And this is a community-owned and community-made memorial. The people we're looking at here on the right is John Lovett, the son of Herbert Stahl Lovett, and in the centre, a squadron leader in Gundung Elder Gary Oakley, and on the left is David Arden, the great nephew of Captain Reg Saunders. So two lineages of those Girrimay soldiers on the left and right. But excluded from the main Remembrance Day and Anzac Day ceremonies that take place at the Australian War Memorial. So even after all of that time, they weren't able to be celebrated for their own culture and the service they brought together. They had to leave the memorial and walk up the hill behind. This is... if you can see the hand. So this is Mount Ainslie behind, and this is the Australian War Memorial site. So that's the context of the Bushland War Memorial, which is up on the hill behind. And as we come in, this is the site of For Our Country. Position here, it's nested within this grove of trees with the lone pine looking over. Each of these trees are from cuttings taken from a site of conflict across the world. And it's positioned to reflect these two great oak trees across here, positioned to reflect the dome of the Hall of Memory, but also positioned to reflect the reflection of Mount Ainslie behind, to speak to, I guess, to reflect through that splintered Indigenous gaze that comes through that facade and that veil, the formal war memorial itself, but also the history of that informal memorial up in the Bushland hill behind. Positioning it in this tucked grove meant that the reflected view of these two oaks kind of bled in and created a continuation of that wall of trees. So again, displacing its objecthood and reinforcing the experiential quality that Dan was talking about. And really specifically, it was important to all of us that it wasn't didactically telling a specific narrative. So the architectural language, as you can see in this plan, is really elemental. Normally when we, as people, when we encounter the world, we bounce back the memories that we have. We've all got these encoded memories of meaning of these aesthetic languages. And we wanted to make sure this building didn't offer that. You weren't able to see, derivative histories from any kind of architectural language, whether it be, European or Indigenous, in terms of built structures. It wanted to, demand that you encountered it. Your relationship, your experience with it was the thing that gave it meaning, and that interaction is the meaningful moment. This two circles in the middle here, there's an earth vessel that we'll speak about in detail a little bit more, a space for ceremonial fire. This larger area is a field of broken basalt stone shards. And I guess the structure itself is this two-way mirror glass veil with the black pigmented rammed earth space for that kind of more interior, introspective gathering on the inside. A couple of drawings here of the front and rear facades and elevation. And this is a section showing that 4 meter deep sealed earth vessel, which is an opportunity for every elders from every single Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander country to bring country to this site, to reinforce that it's on Ngambri and Ngunnawal land, but that the memorial is an absolutely inclusive space, both in terms of the way that the narrative is built from a relationship of yourself, the viewer, with the lens and the space, but also it contains country contains soil from every single country. So it's 100%, as much as possible, a hugely inclusive space. Dan, did you want to speak about perception some more in terms of the veil?
Yeah, so I guess the veil was a way to have people become a part of the memorial in a way that's unexpected. It kind of breaks them down into a group of lenses, and so it's about trying to understand the perception or relationship to others, or the experience of others, how we understand like multiplicity, where we can come into an idea or an experience, and through multiple entry points, but then we can leave them in multiple entry points. It's about the complexity of the relationship that people have to it, and acknowledging. This is a good image. So this is Gestalt psychology's one of the laws that govern it, the law of closure. And it's an easy way for people to understand the way in which my process works. It's kind of like a duality, like a visible. There's a black space that becomes visible, and you have to acknowledge that there's a black space there to understand the forms and the information within the lenses. It's like there's a philosopher from Martinique that he said that the experience of the abyss exists inside and outside of the abyss, and so it's kind of like you can't have one without the other, and you have to acknowledge that darkness, and so here we have a cube that obviously can be read with two facades, one at the bottom at the front and one at the top. It's kind of like a trick about how we perceive things, and I guess that's what I try to do with my work, is to create a situation where hopefully people understand it's an abstraction of their perception, one that allows another way of seeing to become a part of how they understand themselves. So with the memorial, this was kind of like the initial, I guess it kind of, for me, it drove the way that the light and the area, the kind of the experience that people have, in front of the facade, the memorial, and just kind of like I guess I was interested in the way that it changes with the light, and during the day, how it transforms, and it's not a static kind of object like a bronze sculpture. It becomes more activated by light. So in a sense, it's like a sundial. It situates us at this particular place. I think also we should quickly talk about the basalt field at the front.
Yeah, very quickly, just before you leave the veil, the facade, I guess the way I understand it, my experience of what this two-way mirror glass veil offers is, I don't know, I see it in the sense of an empathetic othering. It gives, when you're there, it gives the opportunity. You're not just looking at your mirror in a reflected, in a typical sense. There's almost like a, your inner self, or your there's a fracturing where your self is visible on the other side as other, looking back at yourself. So you almost like you exist as whole on the other side of the facade, on the other side of the veil. And I think it allows a really profound opportunity to witness yourself as other in time, space, experiential, cultural difference. Something that was important for us in the work being not holding to a specific narrative, was ensuring that it was allowed to convey and carry the significance of both formal armed services within the Australian, or formal service within the Australian armed services, but also the conflict of protecting country within the frontier wars, but also allowed a vehicle for truth-telling and knowledge sharing to non-Indigenous people, to allow them to trigger an empathetic questioning of their relationship to indigeneity in Australia. The basalt field in the front that Dan was just talking about is this material is one of a number of stones. It's a flint stone, and the size that we selected each one of these pieces is, what you can see when you arrive on site. They're all broken and flinted to have kind of sharp edges. They're kind of almost nascent axe heads or spear tips, and it's meant to be that kind of I guess a foreground of potential, or potential weapons of war, or fallen weapons of war, but a quite literal connection to an element of physical material which has been used as a weapon of war within country across Australia for 60,000 years.
Can we go through to just quickly to the shot of the guys inside the pavilion?
Absolutely. Just very briefly, as we slow down, this image is, I guess, it brings forward that relationship back to Mount Ainslie, back to that Bushland War Memorial. So speaking to that history within the Australian Armed Forces of Indigenous exclusion, it's not possible to cover over and not in any way desirable to cover over that, the difficulty of that history. It needs to, that memory needs to carry forward. So it's certainly speaking back to that truth and back to that narrative. This is coming forward. When Dan's talking about the change of light, this is the morning light as sun rises over those two first oak trees. The inner space comes alive as the sun, the glass is mostly facing east. So when the new light of every single day passes through the veil, it gets filled with this cloud. It starts at pre-dawn space, very darkened and introspective, allowing you to look through, to the landscape beyond. But as the sun lifts over those oak trees and over Mount Ainslie every single morning, it just bathes that space with this point cloud of light, which shifts like a sundial. As the sun lifts and shifts over, that kind of cloud of light changes and moves throughout the inner space. But this is an image that Dan was referring to of the day before opening, just before the bench was stained and finished. The first black diggers came through and being bathed in that, that extraordinary light. And this is the absolute central point of the whole memorial, is the cast bronze mouth of that earth vessel, that has a very small aperture at the opening, but runs 4 meters deep underground, meaning that you cannot see what's in it. You'll never see the soil that's deposited. It needs to be something that almost, when it's inserted in there, or when it's placed, it kind of communes and it comes back to country. It joins this place here, and what we're seeing is during ceremony is open and revealed in this sense, but normally it's sealed. It has a lid that seals it from weather and security, so it's a contained and protected vessel. Do you have anything more to add, Dan?
If there are any First Nations people out there listening and they want to go to the memorial and take soil from their country to add to it, to contact the War Memorial ahead of time, or while you're there, and they will be able to give you access to the soil chamber, if that's what you would like to do. Yeah.
This image again, and I think we'll move on to Q&A. It's extraordinary the way it activates and comes alive with different light. In that pre-dawn light, when you're in front, your reflection is really potent, and when the sun directly hits the glass, it's incredibly profound inside when the space is filled. And what we're looking at now is that being backlit, when the afternoon sun passes around to the rear, it puts the mirrored veil or lens or facade in shadow, but it highlights the oak tree of the landscape and I guess the people being reflected, and then they come alive even more. And what we haven't been able to convey in this, because these are all still images, is how cinematic, how literally alive when people are walking through. Even though you can see them next to you moving around, you don't recognize that they are the reflection. It becomes this kind of deposited people living this other life in front of you on the other side of the lens. It's quite extraordinary how uncanny the experience is, seeing that reflection move.
So the human experience is what activates the memorial, and that was kind of key in being able to bring them into it. It's something, an experience that is an abstraction that allows that kind of that invitation to become interested in the experience. So.
Also, I think that invitation is almost it's affective in that it's pre-cognition. You're invited to respond to the work before you realize you are. You're responding to it before you even have that thought of I want to respond to it. You're drawn into it because that's how physiologically and that's how we respond to these things. It wanted to kind of bypass an intellectual engagement and start with an emotive physiological one first, and the intellectual engagement comes after that. At least that's how I see it, Dan.
Yeah, no, I agree. I guess it's people. It's a cognitive thing, and then they begin to question what it is, and they want to understand it. So it's it's an experiential thing, and then people have the urge to try to understand what it is, and then they're drawn into it.
I'm going to stop sharing. That's probably time for Q&A from the audience.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. That was really beautiful, and you can definitely see those kind of links and connections. It's almost like the veil kind of is like an extension of the landscape. I don't think that we'll have a lot of time for Q&A, so I just thought that maybe both kind of people from the project should kind of just give a final thought or comment about, I guess, memorials or monuments and how we talk about narrative and how we bring in a more inclusive conversation to the spaces that we create in the city and the built environment.
Anyone?
Well, I guess we're still in a landscape very barren of Indigenous indicators. On not only top of that, women in the landscape, I think it's about 3% of public memorials in Australia are in reference to women. It's a global conversation right now, and we're seeing memorials actually pulled down, which is so incredible. We have to be, just so mindful of the thought process around that and why these things are happening. It's time to start listening and changing that vernacular. And I think through public art, through architecture, there is this opportunity. I think, imagine growing up as a child and walking through a park and seeing, Indigenous heroes, seeing, amazing women that have changed the course of history, and what kind of effect that is going to have on the next generation of people. And that's just something that I'm incredibly mindful of and is really important. So, these collaborations are important, but it's important to listen to this, idea of, these people who are the other, who are the center of the periphery, and that is, something, I'm just mindful of, and, changing the course of history.
Well said. Daniel?
No, I totally agree. We don't, we travel through the built environment, and we're continually bombarded by signposts of a particular dominant narrative, and so I think we've understood that it's not a way to understand our relationship to country, and we have to try to create spaces that are inclusive spaces that don't deny someone who is from another way of kind of being, that it creates a situation where there's more of an equilibrium when we understand history and relationship to place, and that in a sense will create this a beauty that we can be proud of, we can all be proud of, and hopefully Tony and other artists and architects will continue to add to this dialogue, or this space that diversifies how we understand our relationship to things, because the world is complex and it should be understood as a complex place.
It's incredibly important that the lived experience of Indigenous kids, Indigenous people are reflected back at them within the cities that we build for ourselves, and within the narratives embedded within monuments, and people, and women, and Black women of color. That's vital. I mean, it's a very familiar thing. You cannot be what you don't see. Reinforcing the possibilities of life and empowering that life is incredibly important, to position it out there and to make it visible. The other half of that equation is normalizing exposure of indigeneity to non-Indigenous people. The structural racial injustice is not a Black problem, it's a problem of the white majority. We're the ones who control these power structures and inherit the privilege of the status quo of these power structures. Exposing and enhancing enhancing exposure to Indigenous culture by the visibility within monuments, within the just our cultural context, within within the architecture and the built environment we see, breaks down the barriers and makes makes it far easier to bring that I guess Indigenous experience to the center of the conversation, so that a byproduct of that is the political issues, the social issues can't be allowed to happen the way they are, because the white community can see them. At the moment, I think the non-Indigenous community are blind to the empathetic reality of those things, because they just don't have the exposure to what it means. I think these the visibility of it's not just a gestural thing, it's not just a feel-good thing to have visibility within the built environment, within monuments. I think it's absolutely critical to pervade the understanding throughout all of us, every single one of us in this country.
Thank you. I completely agree. Sorry.
Sam, sorry. I was just going to say, in further to what everyone said, and Tony, a few years ago in 2012, we put a bronze sort of larger life-size sculpture of Mum Shirl in Redfern, and the sculpture was delivered on a truck, and we had to crane it into sight, and therefore at some stage Mum Shirl was about 20 or 30 foot in the air on the crane, and all of the community saw her up in the air and started running to the site where she was being installed. And as she was sort of coming down and getting loaded into space, you know, the whole community had heard about this installation, and people were coming in and having their photos taken with her and sitting on her lap and giving her flowers and all of that sort of thing. And the importance of monuments, monuments of women heroes, and particularly monuments of Aboriginal women heroes, is just so important in the community. And Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people can understand the significance of the contribution that Aboriginal people have made to the place and continue to make, and particularly when those contributions are enshrined in this sort of monumentalising. And that was a kind of great experience for us on the day, and we sort of look forward to more of that type of engagement.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I think that this has been an absolutely amazing session, and both of these projects are such beautiful examples of how we can start to speak to our histories in a more inclusive manner. These places are sensitive, political and historically charged, and the way we engage with these monuments and the statement that we make really needs to be so thoughtful and considerate to ensure that we create a narrative that speaks to different perspectives. I guess kind of the question that I want to end this with is, what if we were always that thoughtful and considerate about the history that places and sites hold? And what if we always considered the personal ties, tension and emotion that connects to the country we design and build upon? Why does only specific architecture have to be this considerate to the narrative we convey and the history and connections that we have to it? And why can't all the spaces we create be memorials and monuments to different cultures and their perspectives? These projects are amazing examples of how we can begin to translate these perspectives and narratives to everyday spaces we create. Thank you again to everyone for their time, and based off some of the comments that I've seen, everyone's really appreciated it, and it's been so, it's been an amazing session. So thank you again.